One of the most significant things that happened in the late 19th century was the publication of a book called Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. It was simply an attempt that he made in writing about what he had seen and what he had studied and what he had researched to give an explanation for how things came into being. It was never intended to be the be-all and end-all of how that happened, but simply a reflection from a scientific point of view, from the observable evidence that he had as to how things evolve over time. It was never an attempt to say that humans evolved from apes. That was not a part of really what he was interested in. But in any event, the publication of his book, Origin of Species, created a huge uproar, especially for people who were very religious and had only known the story of Genesis that we read last week on Earth Day, had only known that story and had taken that story of the 6 days of creation and how things came into being, had taken that story to be truth, literal truth. This must be how it was. And so in their minds, the publication of this book and a new interpretation for creation posed a serious threat to their faith, such that by the beginning of the 1900s, a great movement out of Princeton Seminary began to develop that we're still feeling the effects of today. And that movement, well, it comes to be called the fundamentalist movement, said, you know, that book and that theory and that belief directly contradicts what we believe. So what is it that we believe? And they established a series of fundamental beliefs that if you were to be Christian, you had to believe and accept these at face value. It's a long way to get to the point that one of those fundamentals was a belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. You had to literally believe that his body was resurrected and he continued to live in his body, the earthly body. Now, they never exactly said what that meant, what a bodily resurrection would be. And, well, this wasn't the first time somebody had a question about what resurrection was. Because as the story of Mark's gospel comes to an end, there is resurrection. The women are told by an angel, not by Jesus, to go back to Galilee, and there they would see Jesus. And that's the end of the story. Needless to say, the women go and say, Jesus has been resurrected. And much like fundamentalists, they wanted proof and evidence. Or I should say it this way. Much like scientific fundamentalism wants, is some kind of, they must all be from Missouri, let's face it. They needed some proof and evidence for it. Well, there was none, because Jesus had risen from the dead, and that's all anybody knew. In fact, the only evidence in those early days of the followers of Jesus, the only evidence was the empty tomb. That's the only proof and evidence that they had. Little did they know that many centuries later, in Turin, Italy, they would display the shroud, and that was also then. I've seen it myself, and so I was quite impressed, to say the least. Well, anyway, that's another story to tell. As time went on, they began to, because people, if you're going to say Jesus has been raised from the dead, they're going to ask the question, the person you're telling this to, well, how do you know that? Have you seen him? Well, no, they would have to say, no, we didn't see him. And so they began to create stories about resurrection. Particularly as time went on, notice the first story that we had a couple of weeks ago now. Jesus, the disciples are locked in a room, and reference is made to that today. that they're locked behind closed doors because they're fearful that the authorities will come for them next. And Jesus comes and passes right through the walls and the locked door and stands in their midst. One response, it's a ghost. Now think about that for a moment. If Jesus comes and stands in their midst and they think it's a ghost, are they able to recognize him at that point? Doesn't seem to be, because if somebody's a ghost, they didn't say, oh, it's Jesus. And then he says, peace, and the story goes on. Later in that same story, if you remember how it unfolds, Thomas is not with them. And this is the next development in this whole unfolding story of Jesus' resurrection. Thomas says, I won't believe until I stick my finger in the nails holes in his hand and in his side where the spear went. He needs some real physical evidence. That becomes the next stage. There has to be some kind of physical evidence for what resurrection is about. The story today. Notice it's on the same day, right? Easter Sunday is the longest Sunday on the calendar. It lasts 3 weeks, and now we've made it 4 weeks. It's a long story. Perhaps really to suggest that this story, as it develops, takes time to percolate and to transform itself so that no longer, once we're past Easter Sunday, what is it going to mean for the followers of Jesus? So a story, as any story, has to develop and evolve, if you will, not using Darwin's term, but it has to, because each time that it's told and then retold, you see each person that it's told to and that person who retells it, that they have to put themselves into the story itself. That's how it does, right? That's how it stays relevant. That if it's, well, George told me, well, who's George? I don't know George. I know 7 Georges. Which George told you? But if you make it relevant and present in the telling of the story, you include yourself in the telling of the story, and the next generation includes all those previous tellers of the story, and so you see it's natural that a story is going to change and evolve over time. Shouldn't surprise us then. And I love Jay's comment. I got this wonderful picture of Jesus in a hoodie walking along the road. It's no wonder that they wouldn't recognize him, right? In any event, they don't recognize him. Now think for a moment. If this was like a resuscitation of Jesus' body, and that's what resurrection meant, surely they would have recognized him. But they don't recognize him. And nobody along the way has recognized him yet. So it suggests, in the fundamentalist response, it suggests that there isn't a resuscitation of a physical body, and that's what resurrection means. Because I've often thought, that's part of the Christian belief, that we believe in the resurrection of the body on the last day. Do you realize, and this is a little bit off the topic, but I just love telling this story because the image of it is just so imaginative if you think about it, that the resurrection of the body on the last day, this is why Christians for centuries did not permit cremation and the sprinkling of ashes. Because you had to have a body in the grave that was going to resurrect. Could you imagine that if everybody did cremation, oh my gosh, what would the last day look like? You'd have pieces of body flying all over the place because all these cremated remains that people had sprinkled on the ocean and out, it just blows my mind. Maybe I watch too much science fiction, but in any event. So it suggests that they don't recognize him, so that something about the body And by the way, there's at least 4 more stages of this story of resurrection, including Jesus on the shore of the Lake of Galilee eating some of the breakfast fish. I don't know what kind of breakfast that would be, but not my breakfast for sure. That he eats a fish, needing to, again, have physical, visual evidence that Jesus is resurrected. Why that becomes important, I honestly don't know. But in any event, he walks along, and notice they're surprised that he doesn't know. I have to always ask, why are they on this road to begin with? I want to say that my first thought is, they are getting the heck out of Dodge. They're getting as far away from Jerusalem as possible, as quickly as possible, that it's the same day, Easter, and they are on their way to Joppa. That's the coastal city. That's where they left out of the city of Jerusalem, going to Joppa. They're getting away from all of those things that they recount. And notice, this is almost like a formula. Oh, on this day, and on this day, and on this day. That already, by the time that Luke's gospel comes to be written, there's already a set formula for telling about the events of Easter and the events leading up to Easter. So, are you surprised? And Jesus kind of stops. What? What are you talking about? And I'd like to be, like in many instances in which somebody quotes sources but don't really give you the sources, I'd like to be in that smoke-filled room where the white guys were smoking cigars, deciding on what the rules and regulations would be, as to why they decided on certain rules and regulations. So it's like Jesus opens the scriptures to them. It never says what scriptures. I want to know what scriptures that he... Don't you? Isn't that kind of a curious point in the story? What scriptures are you referring to? Because in a good fundamentalist spirit, if it's not in the scripture, it's not to be believed. If you can't prove it by quoting a particular verse, chapter and verse, then it's not anything to believe. And yet, we don't get that. Curious. They're going along, and of course, as the story, because you see, a part of the concern was not only to figure out what actually happened on Easter, but to also ask the question that if Jesus is no longer physically present, what are we going to do? What do we rally around? We've got his teachings, okay, but every other movement around us has a human figure who stands at the forefront of that movement, and everybody's following that. And we followed Jesus all of those years in Galilee, and now we don't have anybody to follow unless you're Roman Catholic and want to believe that Simon was the first pope. Then you've got somebody to follow, and it's okay. But at this point, there isn't. He's not there. How do we keep going? How do we keep focused on what we're supposed to be focused on? Those were the questions that, while it's not written in the scripture, those are the questions they're asking. And notice where they come to. Funny, he's going to go on. Jesus is going to go on with life. The disciples stop. You know, probably they had to be men because they had to feed their stomachs before they could go any further. They have to sit down, and whatever inn they sat down at to have a meal. And in the process of that meal, and Pat asked the right question for the youngsters, notice again the formula. And he took the bread, and he blessed it. And you see all the readers in Luke's community, immediately their ears are buzzing because they know that formula, because that's the formula that they use. He took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to them. That's how simple it is. That's how simple the meal is. That's how simple doing the Lord's Supper is. That's all that's involved with it. In that, their eyes are open and they recognized him, but ask the question, in what way did they recognize him? Did they recognize a bodily Jesus? Or did they recognize that in the breaking of the bread, something different is present to them? In some way or another, that now, again, the scripture doesn't say it, but in some way or another, they no longer need the physical Jesus to be present. Why? Because they have all that they need. Notice, in the breaking, in the blessing, and the breaking, and giving, is that not the action of Jesus? Whether it's his life of blessing in his life, breaking his life, death, giving, resurrection, that's the story. Notice the transference from not just Jesus, but now something that's going to enable the community to go on living their life. Because every time, as we say, as the elders say, every time we break this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim really the death and resurrection of Jesus. That this simple action, could that be what resurrection is about? Why? In what way? Because transformation is taking place. We're engaged with Jesus in the table fellowship, in the fellowship of the community. And notice their response. Were not our hearts burning within us? Do our hearts burn here with a passion that it's like having your ears ring and you say, somebody must be talking about me because my ears are ringing? It's like our hearts are burning, meaning that there's a fire, not literal, but more of a spiritual, that there's a fire in us, and the fire is intended to do what? What happens at the end of the meal? They go out and do what they're supposed to do, to tell others what they had just experienced. We experience Jesus in the breaking of the bread. They don't say we experience the bodily Jesus. They say we experience Jesus in the breaking of the bread. And that's what we've got now, is something that wherever we are, in whatever situation we find ourselves in, whatever geographical location is, whether we're poor or rich, wherever we are, we have something that Jesus has given that enables us to engage with him and with each other in the work of being transformed and changed. That's what resurrection means. I don't know if there's going to be a bodily resurrection, but I know this, that when we break bread and share the cup, there is supposed to be a fire in our midst. And the fire is to burn us with such passion and such commitment that we have to go and tell others what we have experienced. We've encountered Jesus. I liked Pat's question, where is Jesus to be seen? Is it just in the bread and the cup now? No. Jesus is to be seen in us, in the poorest of the poor. Remember, the women were to go back to Galilee, and I suggested that's what they're going to see. People whose encounter with Jesus changed and transformed their lives. First has to happen for us. Then it can happen where we see in others. And then you see how the transformation and change occurs. That's what Easter is about. The transformation and change of the world.